I'm Dustin Abbott, and I am here today to do a quick unboxing and then a breakdown of the features and the design of a lens that is surprisingly interesting, and that is the new Canon EFM 28mm f3.5 macro IS STM. Since the introduction of Canon's mirrorless system, first the EOS M and then the M2 and then finally this body, the M3, Canon shooters have been left to wonder when there's going to be a full setup of lenses for the system. And for the most part, there has been, to date, previous to this lens, there's been 5 lenses that Canon has produced. Only one of those, previously a prime lens, the 22mm f2. But beyond that, most of them have been variable aperture zoom lenses, but there's really been missing both more of the fast primes, but then also there's been a lot of a request for a dedicated macro lens for the system. Now, when this particular lens was announced, the immediate response in the photography communities that I participate with was kind of myself also, because most of us were looking for both a longer focal length than 28mm, and we're also looking for something with a faster aperture than f3.5. However, as the details of this particular lens started to emerge, we started to get a little bit more interesting, because Canon really has kind of been fairly innovative in the design of this particular lens. Now, first of all, while I may need to cover this more thoroughly in a later episode, maybe an Ask the Photographer episode, let me just remind everyone that every lens that you mount on a crop sensor camera, like the M3, which has Canon's APS-C sensor, which is a 1.6 crop factor. And so every lens that you mount on there, no matter what it says on the box, all of them are going to be affected by the crop factor. That's true if you're putting a full frame lens on there, but also if you're using a dedicated system lens. And so this lens is 28mm, and that is its focal length, but when you apply it to the camera body, which you're not going to be shooting with this lens by itself, so when you mount it to the camera body, it is now affected by the crop factor of the camera. And so if you're a Nikon shooter, your crop factor is 1.5 times. If you're a Sony shooter, your crop is the same, 1.5 times. For Canon shooters, it's 1.6. So when the lens is mounted on the camera, a crop sensor body, it now has an effective focal range of 44.8mm on a full frame equivalency. And so that really puts this in more to normal range, which of course is a good thing here. And so its field of vision is basically about the same as what your own field of vision is. And so that makes it a very useful focal length. The other thing that is often a factor when you're dealing with a shorter lens like this, for example, my primary macro lens is Canon's 100mm f2.8L macro IS lens, and so it has a pretty decent working distance at 100mm. A lens like this, of course, has a much shorter working distance. In fact, at its closest focus magnification, it can focus down to just 3.7 inches. And that's 9.3 centimeters. But remember that that's not that 9 centimeters from the front of here, but rather it's from the sensor. And so that means that at its closest magnification, you're pretty much right on top of the subject, and it can still focus down. And so a very ingenious system that Canon has introduced into this to help to offset that is it actually has a built-in LED light. And so that LED light, when you pop the lens out, and by the way, there is a release, it's a retractable design, and so it requires you to release the lens before shooting, and so that helps it to be really compact, and it is a really compact lens. It's only 1.79 inches long, or 45.5mm, and it's also incredibly light. It weighs in at only 130 grams, or 4.59 ounces. And so you're hardly going to notice the weight of the lens at all. Downside, of course, is that it has a plastic mount instead of a metal mount, which is true of a lot of the newer EFM lenses. The upside is, of course, is such a light lens is going to put very little stress on that lens mount, and so I don't actually think that's really much of an issue, truth be told. I just kind of prefer the more metal in the construction. The trade-off, though, is an incredibly light lens that will be really easy to bring along. And I think that makes it intriguing in a lot of ways. So once you have that in the shooting position, there's a little switch here on the side that you can engage that will turn on the built-in LED lights. And so they come out on either side, kind of a half moon on either side. Now there are a few choices. You can have both lights on at 2 intensity settings. Neither is super bright, but it is enough to help to illuminate the subject. You know, when you're very close shooting macro, you're right on top of it. It really enables you to have a little bit of light on your subject from those, and it certainly makes a difference. You also have a choice that if you go from the complete off position, you can hold it down and one side will illuminate. And that helps to give you a little bit more definition. It will cast a little shadow. And then you have the choice to either rotate which side that's going to be on, the left to the right. And then of course you have the 2 intensity settings at both of those. And so really there's a lot of nice little tools that are built into that. Now interestingly, Canon doesn't typically, and they're kind of notorious for not including in the box a lens hood. The exception to the rule is for this lens, and Canon does include a little lens hood here for the lens. However, just note there are a couple of details about that. Number one, it's a screw-on type lens hood, and it's through the screwing on the lens hood that you're able to use regular filters. The actual mount, because of the light, doesn't have any kind of filter threads, and so you've got to use this lens hood / adapter, and the adapter part is the real reason why it's included in the box when Canon doesn't typically introduce a lens hood. And so as far as the actual shading, as you can tell, there's not going to be a whole lot of shading taking place, but the key thing that this little device enables is that it now enables you to use a 43mm filter thread filters and screw those in. The downside, of course, is that as long as this is screwed in, you cannot use the built-in LED lights because they are blocked by the add-on filter. And so, will you end up having this along a lot of the time? Probably not. And so I wouldn't plan on using this often, but of course if you do intend to use filters on your lens, you're going to need to bring that along and the filters to screw into it. But as far as the overall operation, everything works fine. Let me give you a few other specifications. This also has Canon's hybrid IS, which is very beneficial for when you're shooting macro. It helps you to shoot macro more handheld. And I will also note that this is an STM lens, and I found that STM focus speed kind of has a fair amount of variation depending on conditions. The positive note here is that this really is quite a quick focusing lens overall, which is really nice considering that it has such a big focus range. And in fact, it actually has, this is surprisingly, here's the other kind of killer feature here. This lens is actually a greater than 1:1 macro. It has a third setting. You can have the retracted position. So if you use the retraction button here on the side, you can switch it into the typical shooting mode, which gives you a full focus range. But then you can also switch it into a third position, which is the super macro mode. And so that is basically between 0.7 times magnification up to 1.2 times magnification. And so it's nice that it gives you a greater than 1:1 magnification, which is certainly quite useful in a lot of settings. But just know when you use the super macro mode that in operation it kind of acts like a built-in extension tube, and that it allows you to focus down even closer, but at the trade-off of not having the full focus range. And so in super macro mode, don't even try to focus it at something beyond just a few inches in front of the actual lens. It has a very limited focus range, and it's really only for using in those types of situations. And so while you're in super macro mode, the full focus range will not be available to you. And so if you want to go back to shooting a full range, you need to switch it back into the typical macro mode. But of course, the inclusion of that built-in is a very handy feature. I will note that in its actual application, it's going to be easier to use that if you're in a fairly stable environment, because you have to get really, really close to the subject, and your focus distance is very short, but on top of that, your depth of field is incredibly tiny. And so you're going to need to stop that down a fair bit to have much in focus at that kind of focus distance. The lens itself is already proving to be quite sharp, and I'll be covering the actual image quality more in the next episode, in which I will review it after I've shot with for a while. I'll share lots of samples and we'll break down the image quality together. I will say, however, that there's a lot of potential for sharpness in the lens, and I haven't really tested all of the potential shortcomings of it optically, but neither have I seen hardly any chromatic aberrations so far, so it looks like it's going to function quite well when it comes to all of that. It's fairly complex. It's 11 elements in 10 groups, and so it's a pretty complex lens for a fixed focal length, but that's the nature of a macro lens as well. In essence, it is shaping up to be a pretty interesting lens, and if you'll look down below, I've got an image gallery already started with photos of the lens, but also I'll be adding ongoing new photos taken by the lens to that image gallery. So I encourage you to check back often throughout the course of this review period, as I'll be adding images over the next few weeks to that. I'm Dustin Abbott, and you can find linkage to follow me on social media down below, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.